Mute.
All right, everyone, we're right at the top of the hour, so I want to go ahead and get started, make sure we leave Deborah as much time as possible. Happy Wednesday, and thank you for joining us here for Soul Injury Self-Awareness Inventory. So I am very excited today because we have an extra special treat in store from Deborah, who many of you know and love and are very familiar with. For those of you who may not be familiar with her work, Deborah Grassman is a nurse practitioner who provided hospice care at the VA for 30 years. She took care of more than 10,000 veterans, and those 10,000 dying veterans taught her lessons about how to attain personal peace, and also, ironically, those lessons came from people who were trained for war. Deborah came to realize that these lessons could be extrapolated to the general public, and that's when she and 4 other hospice nurses left the VA and founded the nonprofit Opus Peace, an organization that provides training and tools to people like yourselves to take the soul injury message to their families, workplaces, communities, civic organizations, and faith communities as well. So Deborah is a contributing author for 3 textbooks. She has 22 published articles, and there are 3 documentary films featuring her work. She's also published 2 books, Peace at Last, Stories of Hope and Healing for Veterans, as well as The Hero Within, Redeeming the Destiny We Were Born to Fulfill. So again, we are very honored to have her here. Just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping things before I hand it over to Deborah. Many of you are familiar with Zoom, but just want to let you know again, at the end of the webinar, Deborah and her her Opus Peace team will be answering questions. If you hover at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. Feel free to answer your questions there. If there's any that can be answered live, I'll be happy to take care of those. Otherwise, we're going to wait until the end of the presentation. I've also gotten quite a few questions regarding continuing education credits. Unfortunately, we are not offering those for this live event. If you are a We Honor Veterans partner, however, this webinar most definitely counts toward your educational staff requirements for your partner activities. And again, I also had a lot of questions from people that were upset they weren't going to be able to make it today, but fear not. If you happen to miss part of the webinar, as always, the full thing in its entirety, the recording, will be posted on the We Honor Veterans website for free on-demand viewing whenever you need it, as well as the accompanying tool that Deborah is going to go over. So we will have a new section on the website that'll just be dedicated to Opus Peace and Deborah Grassman resources, just to make it easier for you all to find. So all you'll need to do is go to the home page. You're familiar with the Spotlight section. There will be a link there. There will also be a link under We Honor Veterans Partner Resources. And if you have any trouble finding those or have any questions, feel free to email the Veterans inbox. That's veterans with an S at NHPCO, and I'll be happy to help you out. So again, those resources and the recording will be up on the We Honor Veterans website within the next week. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Deborah.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I can't thank you and NHPCO for recognizing the value of this phenomenon that we have witnessed that we call soul injury. But more importantly, I appreciate how NHPCO is wanting to make sure that it's more than just raising awareness about the concept, but actually how do we take it the next step further, which is how do we implement it into our practice. So what I'm going over today will help us do that. So I want to start out by just saying that soul injury we believe to be an overlooked, unassessed wound. And my hope is that after this hour and a half together, it will no longer be an overlooked, unassessed wound in your life or in your practice. As Catherine said, my practice is based in having done hospice work with 10,000 dying veterans in the VA. And they are the source of this information. They have taught me more than any other source that I have. And that's, I feel very humbled to be and hopefully be qualified to speak on their behalf since they are no longer here. But what I'm going to be talking to you today is what I think they would want you to know as you're caring for dying people, whether they're veterans or non-veterans. When we were taking care of these veterans who were dying in our VA hospice, what we saw was a lot of PTSD. A lot of them had PTSD, and it does become exacerbated sometimes at the end of life. But we saw something more than just PTSD. But for a long time, we didn't have words for it. We didn't have a name for it. Years later, the Department of Defense and the VA started identifying similar things, what they called moral injury. And it was exactly what we were also witnessing as our veterans were dying. So that helped us so much. But as time went on and we started looking at this, we realized there was more than, we were also seeing more than just moral injury. There was more with veterans sometimes and patients sometimes than just the violation of a moral code. So again, we were kind of left with, well, what is it? And that's when we came up with the idea of soul injury and realized that moral injury is a subset of, an important subset, especially in hospice care, of soul injury. So what I know, and that I know you all in a hospice audience know, is that dying people know things that the rest of us do not. I mean, the day before you are given a terminal diagnosis, you pretty much take your life for granted. The day after you're given a terminal diagnosis, you wake up. You wake up to the idea that your life matters. Things that you thought were so important suddenly pale in importance. Things that you didn't think important seem urgent to complete. So in my mind, awakening to the idea that we matter is the gift that death brings to us. So you can appreciate that people at the end of their lives, and I know you all witness this as well as I do, is that when they're getting ready to meet their maker, so to speak, there is what's called an unvarnished truth that surfaces. There is an unburdening of the soul that occurs very naturally at the end of life. And I know hospice staff have a unique vantage point to witness this shift of perspective that occurs. You and I have been privileged witnesses for this window of perspective that can inform our own lives as well as others. What I know is that trauma changes at the end of life. You know, for all of us, as we are dying, as we come to the end of our lives, our conscious mind gets weaker and our unconscious mind gets stronger. And that is sometimes when these memories, past memories, surface unbidden. And sometimes if they're traumatic memories, for example, it can cause agitation. And I don't know about you, but to me, there's nothing worse than an agitated death. I consider that a hospice emergency. Well, there are thousands of hospice workers like you and I. There are thousands of PTSD professionals. But there are only a handful of professionals who have specialized in both hospice and trauma. And I believe it is the confluence of both of these patient populations that is yielding lessons that haven't been previously appreciated. And I believe they're lessons for the world. So I want to give you just a little bit of a bird's eye view of my world working at the VA as a nurse practitioner. And much of my job involved being a consultant and triaging patients on the non-hospice inpatient unit. In other words, I was in the ICUs and the general medicine units a lot seeing patients. And one day I went in to see this one patient. He was a World War II patient, veteran. So I was trying to assess his needs, and so I asked him if there was anything from that war that still troubled him now. And he shook his head, yes. I asked him if he would want to tell me about it, and he shook his head, yes. But then he told me that he was too ashamed to say it out loud. And so he motioned me down toward his pillow, and this is what he whispered in my ear. He said, "Do you have any idea how many men I have killed?" And I just shook my head no. I didn't say anything. That is one of those sacred moments you do not want to corrupt with words. And then he said, "Do you have any idea how many throats I've slit?" Oh, again, I just shook my head no. And we sat in silence, sharing that man's suffering for a long time together. And at length, I asked him if it would be meaningful if I said a prayer asking for forgiveness for the things that he had seen and done. And he shook his head yes. And so I placed my hand firmly on his chest, and I prayed something like this that day. Dear God, this man comes before you acknowledging the pain he has caused others. He has killed. He has maimed. He hurts with the pain of knowing he did this. He hurts with the pain of humanity. He comes before you now asking for forgiveness. He needs your mercy to restore his integrity. He comes before you saying, "Forgive me for the wrongs I have committed." Dear God, help him feel your saving grace. Restore this man to wholeness so he can come home to you soon. Amen. Now, this man kept his eyes closed throughout that prayer, but there were tears streaming down his face. And when he did open his eyes, this big smile came. It was almost palpable how much lighter he felt. It was such evidence to me of just how heavy guilt and shame weigh. So you can see from this story that it is one thing to witness trauma. It is another thing to have caused the trauma. That is a deeper level of injury. That is a soul injury. More specifically, in this case, a moral injury. So if we look at the process that occurred with this veteran, the healing process began with opening up to the pain and the shame that he had been running away from for decades. It was that shame that separated him from his own sense of self, from his own inner sense of goodness and beauty. And telling his story of shame to a receptive witness allowed him to re-own this lost part of himself that he had exiled out into unconsciousness. And forgiving himself, creating that safe place within his own self, allowed him to have a safe home to bring that exiled piece of self back. And that smile of relief, to me, demonstrates the revitalization that occurs when we can be reconnected with all the scattered pieces of self. Now, this man died the next day, and I contend that he died healed. I want to introduce you to a different patient. The veteran you see on your screen is a young World War II veteran. I met him about 50 years after this photograph was taken. He too was on a general medicine unit. And when I came in and had introduced myself and I was trying to assess what he needed so he could die healed, I asked him how he felt, realizing that he was nearing the end of life. And his answer really astounded me. He said, "Oh, I feel blissful." I said, "Blissful? How can you say you feel blissful? You're getting weak. You can hardly get out of bed. You can't do any of the things you used to enjoy doing." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I was a POW, a prisoner of war." He went on to explain that he had endured unspeakable tortures in a German POW camp. But I could see as he was telling me these things that he felt completely at peace with those memories. And so I didn't really need to delve into them. Well, the war was over. He comes back to the United States and he becomes a University of Southern California art professor. 10 years later, the Richard Wagner Opera House in Germany called him and asked him to be their set designer for one of their operas they were going to do. And initially, he turned it down. He told me that he couldn't stand to go back to the land that had tortured him. And not only that, he said that Richard Wagner, the composer, was aligned with Hitler. But he told me that he got to thinking about it and he realized he had just turned down an opportunity of a lifetime. And so he called them back. In fact, it was Richard Wagner's granddaughter, Friedlinde Wagner, that had called him. So he called her back that he would take the job. Well, he told me that he went over there and he said there were all these triggers causing all these flashbacks for him. But he said the worst trigger was the German language. Because as the guards had been torturing him, of course, they were saying things to him. But he had to learn the language in order to direct the workers on the set. And so he did. Well, then they asked him to become a German interpreter. And he told me, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I looked at him and I said, I don't get that. And he said, well, to be an interpreter, you can't just translate one word for the other. You have to understand the context of the language. And to do that, you have to understand the people. He said, in fact, you have to be a bridge of understanding. And he said, once I did that, I learned to love people that formerly I only knew to fear. And he said, that was my real release date from the German POW camp. He said, if I hadn't done that, I would still be imprisoned today. Wow. So what this man taught me was that the only difference between ordinary people like myself and heroes like him was that heroes don't waste their suffering. This veteran used his suffering to learn and to grow. He used his suffering to connect with his soul, with his deepest self. So I find these contrasts fascinating and found them fascinating early in my career when I was hearing people coming through similar experiences and coming out with very different outcomes and even very different deaths, sometimes decades later. So it caused me to ask questions. And the question I was asking myself were things like, what causes some people to disconnect from their sense of self and causes others to strongly connect with their sense of self? And what I noticed was that it sort of depended on ways that these veterans had to express or not express their emotional pain and their suffering. And those, like this last patient I told you about, who was an art professor and was able to express his suffering through art, seemed to be able to integrate that traumatic experience easier. So I have found that people that was closely connected to nature or the arts or having a sense of mission and purpose seem to be more connected with their own sense of self. The other thing, as the latter patient that I told you about, where he had confronted those feelings, he had even gone back to the land that had tortured him. Unlike the previous patient who was still carrying that sense of slitting other people's throats and had never confronted those feelings until, at least consciously, until the day before he died. If you look at this photograph on the screen right now, you see 3 soldiers all in the exact same traumatic situation. And you see 3 very different reactions and responses. So the question might be, well, which one of them might be at risk for developing a soul injury later on? And I would contend that all 3 of them are. At this point, we have no way of knowing, but all 3 of them are at risk. So early in my career, there were some clues as I was doing hospice consults, in addition to managing the 10 patients that we had on our inpatient hospice unit. And the initial clues that I noticed when people came to the end of life is that they often carried a lot of unmourned loss. And when I talk about loss, as you all in a hospice audience know, loss is not just about dying. It's not just about bereavement. It includes failure. It includes disappointment. I mean, think about if you have suffered a divorce. Even if it's a divorce you really wanted, it's nevertheless a loss. You didn't walk down the aisle on the day that you got married with the idea of, oh boy, I can't wait to suffer a loss of a divorce. You know, it's the loss of a dream. It's the loss of the future you thought you would have. It even can be the loss of the past that you thought was. So think about other losses like loss of jobs, and those are all losses. The other thing we see a lot of at the end of life, and you've already heard that from the stories I told, is unforgiven guilt and shame. And what we found as hospice nurses, that when we could help people grieve their losses, when we would help people forgive themselves and forgive others for what they had done or not done, we saw this liberating shift often occurred, like the man I told you about who had slit the throat. And then sometimes people would say to us, why didn't I learn how to do this years ago? Why did I have to be dying in order to learn how to do this? And truly, that was the impetus for 5 of us VA hospice nurses leaving the VA to start Opus Peace, a nonprofit, so that we could bring the lessons that these 10,000 dying veterans had taught us. So we have been the witness bearers for lessons about attaining peace. And ironically, it came from people who had been trained for war. So let's talk about soul injury. If we look at the definition, we have defined it as a wound that is traumatically or insidiously acquired, which separates a person from who they really are. So it's really easy to see the traumatic soul injuries that occurred. You heard 2 opening stories that easily demonstrate those, and it's pretty obvious. What's harder to see sometimes and appreciate is insidiously acquired soul injuries. These injuries happen more gradually, over time, more chronically, and yet the endpoint ends up being the same. When you get cut off from your own sense of self, your own sense of inner goodness and beauty, you still end up with a soul injury, whether you acquired it by trauma or whether you acquired it slowly and gradually. This soul injury wound is perpetuated by unmourned loss, unforgiven guilt and shame, and diminished self-compassion, an inability to be able to forgive ourselves, to be reunited with that deepest self. And when a soul injury causes a person to become disconnected from their own inner goodness and beauty, they might experience emptiness or a loss of meaning or a sense that a part of self is missing or even defective. Now you may say, well, what is soul? Why do you choose this term soul? Why do you use that? Well, I'm going to say in many ways, it's really hard to define that word. In fact, the more you try to define the word soul, in some ways, the further away I think you get from it. But if we look it up in the dictionary, it says that soul is the vital or essential part of something or someone. So if we can think about soul as the essence, the essential part of our being, that is beyond body, that is beyond mind. If we can think of it as that vital part of ourself, that gives us a sense of vitality, that gives us a sense of self, of who we are, that idea of being a human being and that beingness. We use this term soul every day, in our everyday language without any religious connotation. Things like soulmate, soul food, deep in my soul, lost my soul. And in all of these ways, we are referencing this deeper part of ourselves without a religious connotation. So Opus Peace has no agenda about soul. I am not going to try to convince you what soul is or what soul is not. But I am here with an agenda about soul injury, whatever you want to call it, the phenomena of soul injury, whatever label we put on it. Because what I'm trying to convey is a being injury, developing language that can articulate this being injury so that we have a language to have a conversation about it. Well, why should we be addressing soul injury? Well, it's because soul injury approaches are different than traditional PTSD approaches or chronic stress interventions that we might be familiar with. The approach includes learning how to grieve losses, failures, disappointments, so that that loss can be released. It includes learning how to forgive ourselves and others so that that can release the guilt and the shame. It includes learning how to connect with our deeper self to find meaning and purpose, which releases those feelings of I don't matter. And part of my master's degree was studying logotherapy, which the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, developed. And you may have read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it used to be very prominent in a lot of our practices. And I'm sort of disheartened that with time, his work has started fading into the background. And yet he showed how much this meaning and purpose and being able to stay connected to ourselves, the value of that. So grieving, forgiveness, logotherapy, they're not routinely taught in PTSD programs, and they're not routinely taught in healthcare curriculum in general. So that's part of the value. Just the term soul injury, you can say that concept to someone about soul injury, and if they have a soul injury, a lot of times you don't even have to define it for them. They resonate, they recognize its relevance immediately. I just want to give you an example of that. A couple of years ago, I was speaking over in Tampa, near where I live, at the SOCOM conference, the Special Operations Command. The Special Operations Command, SOCOM, is actually at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. And they were having a conference, and I was speaking at it. And there was a veteran in the audience who was taking notes. In fact, his note is actually up there on your screen right now. He came to me afterward, and when I was in the back signing books and what have you, and he handed me this note. And this is what the note said. Milestones. February 28th, 1999. Depart military service knowing that something's wrong. March 1st, 1999 to May 21st, 2014, which was the day I was speaking. Searching for answers, going to therapy, treatment, retreats, introspection, trying to figure out why I feel so bad and so sad. May 21st at 1:45 p.m., the light goes on. I have a soul injury. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. I can tell you that this man was in tears when he hugged me afterward, to be able to identify and articulate what he had been experiencing for a couple of decades. This is the reason to start the conversation, to introduce the concept of soul injury. Well, let's look at how soul injury gets started. I want to introduce you to Paul Schutte. Paul Schutte is a professor at George Washington University, and he is a Vietnam veteran. And he talks about how he loved basic training. In fact, he particularly loved target practice, and he was particularly good at it until they changed the target from a round circle to a silhouette of a human being. And then he couldn't do it. So he goes to his commanding officer and tells him that he cannot do this. And you can appreciate that his commanding officer did not receive that well. And so Paul was given as punishment KP duty. So Paul was in the kitchen doing his KP duty, and on the stove was a pot of boiling water. Paul plunged his hands into that pot of boiling water so as to render them incapable of holding a weapon. Well, Paul says that he was hospitalized. His injuries eventually healed, and they did retrain him to become a medic. Paul goes over to Vietnam, and he works in the operating room. I just want to read to you in Paul's own words, his writing, what he writes about his last day in the operating room. Here's what he writes. The patient was conscious and gently pleading to not let him die as we ran him straight into the operating room. The medical team worked furiously to save this young soldier. The clattering noise of the instruments, the rhythmic breathing of the respirator, and the shouts for more blood were deafening. Then silence. He was dead. Everyone left the room. The doctor looked at me and ordered, "Finish up here." I was left alone with this beautiful, lifeless body. I had seen dozens, maybe hundreds before, but this time I screamed to the heavens. A sound I had never heard was coming out of me. And then it happened. My soul vanished, escaped my body, and left me empty. My last weeks in Vietnam are a blur. I was escorted out of the OR that day, and I was ordered to never return. I left Vietnam on June 22nd, 1970. I wept as the Jeep pulled away. I was numb, and I was soulless. I have heard those types of words from many veterans. I was numb and I was soulless, something along that line. What I have also witnessed is using numbing agents to not feel those ugly feelings, such as the helplessness, the emotional pain, the guilt, the shame, the loneliness. On your screen right now, I have just a few numbing agents that are commonly used. When we think of numbing agents, we often think of alcohol and drugs, but we all numb out things we don't want to feel. And what I will tell you is when you work in hospice, as you all well know, when people's regrets often surface at the end of life, when you look at what those regrets surround often, it's almost always associated with some misuse of numbing agents. They have misused numbing agents to separate them from people that they love, and even separated them from their own sense of self. So one of my hopes is that we can be aware not only of other people's numbing agents, sometimes those are easy to see, but to be aware of our own, to be mindful of our own numbing agents. I know for me, sometimes when I have feelings I don't want to feel, I like to numb them out by turning the television on and escaping like that. So as I said, lots of different ways, but what's important is for us to know the ones we are using and how we misuse them sometimes to separate from our own sense of self. Well, Paul was banished from the OR that day because he was deemed a quote-unquote weak soldier because he wasn't able to maintain that stoic front. And any of you who've heard me speak before, you've heard me speak about stoicism. It is a form of denial. It is part of our American heritage for all of us. It's pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's rugged individualism. Certainly in the military, stoicism is absolutely essential on a battlefield. I always have to ask myself, however, what about after that battle is over and that soldier is no longer a soldier, but becomes a husband or a father or a dying human being? And I will tell you that stoicism can sometimes complicate peaceful dying. If you look up that word in the dictionary, it says this: showing indifference to joy, grief, pleasure, and pain. I want you just to think about the implications of that, the disconnect that has to occur in order for this to happen. Now, I am not against stoicism. As I just said, we absolutely need stoicism. The grit of stoicism helps us get through many days. But I tell people this: what you want to do is to use your stoicism more like a door that you can open and close at will, as opposed to a wall that ends up imprisoning you behind it. Because I think we need both the grit of stoicism and the grace of our soul in order to be whole. We just need to be careful that we don't use the stoicism to wall out the grace. So what 10,000 dying veterans have taught us is that stoicism is necessary in some ways, and it's a hindrance in others, and it's important to be able to make that distinction. So when we think about soul restoration, that includes learning how to re-own these pieces of ourselves that we would rather not feel. It includes being able to rehome, to learn how to create a safe place where that exiled piece of self feels like it will be heard and it will have a voice within our own self. It won't be numbed out. And when we are able to re-own and rehome that piece of self, we receive the energy that that part of self is holding. So when we do this, we become revitalized because we can learn how to develop an intimate relationship with this part of ourself that's carrying our emotional pain. Now, when I say the word intimacy, people often automatically think about other people or sexual relationships, whatever it might be. But the intimacy that I'm talking about is emotional intimacy. And I'm talking about emotional intimacy within our own self, the part of self holding emotional pain. Because if we don't know how to do that, we'll be looking around outside of ourselves for that. I'll be running to everybody else, Catherine, will you take my pain away? Oh, Pat, will you make me feel better and comfort me? We'll look for other people to do that. Or we'll look for shortcuts, whether it be television or alcohol or the internet or whatever it might be. What I know is that when you box up your emotional pain, your vitality, your personhood, your passion gets boxed up as well. So I don't care if you are on a combat field or if you work in a hospice or wherever you might be working, where there is stress around you, where there are losses around you. Unmourned loss sabotages our bodies, our minds, and our spirits, and separate us from our own sense of self. And that is a recipe for soul injury. And I believe soul injuries are fatal if they deaden our sense of being. So I might just pose the question, how would the world be different if we weren't afraid of emotional pain? And of course, the question for all of us to ask ourselves is, how would my world be different if I wasn't afraid of my own emotional pain? And how would our children's world be different if we taught them not to be afraid of their emotional pain? Because what I believe is, if we weren't afraid of emotional pain, we would have less of a relationship with our numbing agents and more of a relationship with our soul. So one of the things that's important for us to do with our own emotional pain as well as with others, and that is to be able to validate it. That is how we can express and connect with compassion. Validation is an act of self-compassion that acknowledges that part of self holding that loss, that helps us feel the emotions of that, the sensations of loss. It counters denial, and denial is often said to be an acronym for don't even know I am lying. Denial is one of the most prevalent numbing agents that we all use. So when we can just kind of take a moment to lick our wounds, that allows us to feel the pain so that that part of self feeling it doesn't have to be exiled into unconsciousness, where it often comes out in angry outbursts or it stays hidden, kind of silently and insidiously sabotaging our lives. Because when you're living your life passionately, you stop numbing the pain and instead let yourself feel it. You stop being afraid of your pain. You tell your ego to stop covering your pain up with anger, fear, and shame. You talk to the part of yourself carrying the pain. You comfort that part of yourself, and not with numbing agents either. And you tell a trusted other person about your pain. So going back to Paul Schuete's story again, thinking about his transition to come home. This is what Paul writes. Once home, no one asked us about our experience. And even if they did, we lied or told stories about our buddies or some of the pranks or what the food was like. We did not tell them the truth. Why would we? Why would I want to burden my loved ones with my experiences of horror, of listening to the screams of the dying, of watching the dogs steal amputated limbs, of the chopper that landed with a huge canvas bag suspended under its belly while we were ordered to assemble 11 complete soldiers? Even now, I am finding it hard to reveal this truth to you. But these are the kinds of truths that each of my brothers and sisters who served in that war bring with us as we age and seek care and support. For those of you who will be caring for my generation of veterans, you need to open yourself to listen to our stories. They have been our burden. And as we approach our later years, they become even heavier, and we need to lay them down before we die. So Paul gives us, especially in hospice, some of our marching orders. Paul is also pointing out something that in the literature is called secondary wounding. So secondary wounding is frequently reported to be harder to forgive, and I want to give you a few examples of this. I've had many veterans tell me similar things, but I just want you to pose this question to you. Which do you think is harder to forgive, the Viet Cong or the Americans who spat on that soldier when he came home? I can tell you that I've had many, in fact, just not too long ago when I was up in Maryland a couple of months ago doing a presentation talking about secondary wounding, and a Vietnam vet came up to me and he said, you know, I have no trouble forgiving the North Vietnamese for holding a rifle at me and shooting at me, because they were just doing what they were supposed to be doing, what they were trained to do, just like I was. But he said, when I got home and I was spit upon and I was called a murderer and a baby killer, he said, I am bitter about that. He said, I haven't been able to let that go yet. That is secondary wounding. And many people will tell you that secondary wounding is harder to forgive than the original wound. Think about this. Which is harder to forgive, the molester or the parent who protected the molester? I've heard from many, many adults who were molested as children, and they will say that it was harder to forgive their mother for protecting her husband than it was for to forgive the person who had molested them. Which is harder to forgive, the comrade who raped you, or the commanding officer who looked the other way, or maybe even demoted you for reporting it? I can tell you sex discrimination is still very prevalent in our society, whether we want to pretend like it is or not. And even if by some miracle it could be erased today, it doesn't mean that all of the past discrimination isn't surfacing at the end of life when we see people decades later. Which is harder to forgive, the bully who taunted and verbally assaulted you, or the teacher who wouldn't stand up for you? Why is that? Because when we don't get support from trusted people or trusted agencies who are supposed to be protecting us and standing up for us, that betrayal penetrates deeply. It causes us to question who we are. PTSD research is also showing this. There's a lot of different factors that increase your risk for getting PTSD, but consistently, one of the most important factors is whether or not you got the support that you needed at the time that the trauma occurred. What we're finding is that the best way to treat PTSD is to prevent its occurrence to begin with, and the best way to do that is by getting the support there as quickly as possible. Because again, what happens when we don't get the support, or when we reach out to someone that we trust for the support of what's happened, we end up getting this mixed message of, well, I love you, but I won't stick up for you. I don't want to get involved. And that causes a lot of confusion, suspicion. It complicates that sense of self. And the result is people end up thinking that they don't matter. They think they're not worth it. Well, I must not be worth it if nobody will stick up for me. And then people are left alone with that. And that indeed often becomes a soul injury, no matter what the source is. So again, going back to Paul's story, he writes, my arrival home was not a celebration for me. All that had been was no longer. I was a stranger in a strange land. I spent the next 14 years wandering and restlessly trying to do good. I was trying to coax my soul back. I became a hunter-gatherer of life. I lived in 10 different places, had 11 different jobs, had 6 significant relationships, and traveled to 10 different countries. I was on a mission, but I wasn't sure what that mission was. I now realize that I was suffering from soul injury, and I didn't even know it. What I have found is transitioning, just as Paul was talking about, it took him 14 years as he tried to transition out of military service, as he was trying to transition from a life that he didn't even know anymore when he came back home. That in general, losses, changes, and transitions are often very, very difficult. And the reason why is they are fraught with a lot of uncertainty where you can't control what's going on. And so therefore people often are hypervigilant. They kind of stay on guard, and they may even be a little bit paranoid whenever transitions and changes occur. And certainly one of the biggest changes that we all experience in doing hospice work is, of course, death, as we're learning how to let go of this physical body and physical world that we all are so familiar with. So at any rate, what ends up happening is, in loss and changes that occur, is people often lose themselves. They lose their self-confidence to be able to navigate that change. So the research, in addition, the other factor that's very prominent in the PTSD research, at least, is not only do you need the support to get through something, but the other thing that it shows is that if you were helpless to fight back the assault or to escape and get away from it, if you just kind of freeze or you're stuck and you can't escape or fight back, that also increases your risk for PTSD, because that leaves those stress chemicals circulating in the body, and it ends up getting stored into body memory. If you haven't read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and you're interested in PTSD, I would suggest you do that. We at Opus Peace consider him to be the leading researcher. He has the Center for Trauma in Boston, and you can also YouTube him and see him. But he will very much convince you through his research and his decades of work of how this occurs. But he says that PTSD, for example, is largely caused by immobilization, by that sense of helplessness. And the reason I'm kind of departing into this or detouring over into this is because this has huge impact, I think, with hospice at the end of life. And we haven't yet really recognized this, and I hope to shed light on this. So let's talk about trauma. When you are being traumatized, in a trauma where you can't fight back or run away. So let's just use an example, let's just say, of rape. If you were being raped, while you are being raped, you feel utterly helpless. The day after the trauma, the day after the rape, what people end up telling themselves is, I will never put myself in a position to again to feel so vulnerable, so helpless again. I'm going to try to control everything to prevent that from happening again. I mean, that only makes sense. That is only logical to do that. Therefore, it's not unusual for people who have been traumatized to be rather overly controlling for understandable reasons. So let's talk about helplessness at the end of life. For all of us, as we come to the end of life, we get weaker. We start losing our independence. We start becoming more helpless. We start having to depend on more and more on other people. That's just part of the dying process. Well, as traumatized veterans get weaker and come to hospice, and they start feeling very helpless and they're losing control, they sometimes even get agitated because they're fighting really hard to regain control. Well, now you have an agitated hospice patient, and I don't know about you, but to me, that's a hospice emergency. And again, my natural instinct is to run to the medication cart and give them a benzodiazepine or something to try to calm them down. Only sometimes what we would find is that when you gave this agitated veteran a benzodiazepine, rather than calming them down, you would actually get a paradoxical reaction. It would actually make them worse, and they would fight harder to regain control. Well, why would that be? Well, that's because medications like Ativan takes you further out of control. It makes you feel more helpless. And that helpless feeling acts as a trigger for the original trauma. So, what's the paradoxical intervention? The intervention is actually to help them feel their helplessness. to be able to come to peace with the reality of helplessness that does occur at the end of life, unless you die suddenly. And also, there's other tools that we have available, and I know I explained it well in the Vietnam presentation I did just a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to re-explain it, but the anchoring heart technique, and we have that information on our website. So, helplessness at the end of life. The literature says that up to 40% of all of us experience some type of terminal restlessness, and terminal restlessness does respond quite well to the benzodiazepine. But my point is this, is being able to look at a differential diagnosis, be able to look at PTSD versus terminal restlessness versus soul injury, because the interventions are different for each of these. The other thing I want to mention is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health. The DSM talks about how children experience PTSD differently than adults do. They tend to act it out. What I want to do is start a campaign to get a sentence added in there that, hey, dying people do the same thing. They're like children. As their conscious mind is receding, they too tend to act out the PTSD. That's why regular PTSD treatments aren't going to necessarily be very helpful in those last few days, those last few weeks of life. So, more clues earlier in my career about connecting with our beingness, and that is this. When we can cultivate qualities that redeem our personhood, that helps us stay connected to who we are. And what are those qualities? Well, I identify them as honesty, courage, and humility. Now you may say, well, why did you choose those three of, all the many, many, many? Well, there's a reason. And that's because dying people have what I again call that unvarnished truth. I remember being at the bedside of a man, and he had used alcohol to numb much of his emotional pain throughout his life. But when he had been diagnosed, and he, in the last few weeks, had not been using alcohol, and his family was at bedside, and there was this great kind of reunion and opening up of relationship. And I commented to him about being able to be so honest and make these changes in the last few weeks. And he turned to me and he said, well, now while I'm dying is no time for me to keep lying to myself. So that is just so true. The other thing is courage. What I saw on dying veterans' deathbeds was this. I saw tremendous courage. And I always think about it like this. No one can die for you. I don't care how much supportive family you have around you. No one can take that place and make that leap into the unknown. It can only be done for yourself, and that takes a lot of courage to do. And then there is that quality of humility. People have not died before. They don't know how to do it. So when they see someone like us with hospice, and they know that we have this type of experience, often they will ask for help. They know that we are a resource, and they are more willing then to receive help and to listen. So the last chapter of Paul Schuete's story that we can learn from, here's what Paul writes. One day, as I was sitting on a beach, it happened. My soul returned. It finally felt safe enough to re-enter my body. I found peace. I found peace that had found its residence inside of me. I suppose that the lesson in my story is that we are all survivors in this life, whether we are a soldier returning from war, or a person grieving the death of a loved one, or a survivor of any of life's tragic moments or transitions. A person's soul needs care, and it will return if it gets lost. It can be coaxed back. Our wounds can be healed, and life can be good. We can create a future for ourselves and a place for our soul to reside. We can be enhanced by life's challenges and not remain damaged. It's all in the seeking, in the gathering of good, in paying attention, in being grateful for the small moments of goodness. It takes time to create a safe place for the soul to dwell. Perhaps we each have to create a life filled with people we love and nurture us, and with people we can love and nurture in return. I am who I am today because of my experience in Vietnam. I appreciate the fact that it taught me the true meaning of love and friendship. It taught me that I could be so much stronger than I could have imagined, and that human beings are both flawed and perfect. I would not trade my experience for anything, nor would I wish it on anyone. And therein lies the paradox and my opus of peace. I said in the beginning that hospice staff have a unique vantage point. We are privileged witnesses to see these things happen at the end of life, where this window of perspective, this shift occurs. But I've got to tell you that I realized just a couple of months ago that it's not so unique after all. We do monthly webinars for our Opus Peace members. And 2 months ago, we did a webinar in which Dr. Luann Comforty Brown at the University of South Florida talked about her doctoral dissertation. And Professor Brown, doctoral dissertation was this: More Than a Flesh Wound, Narrative Descriptions of Combat Experience and Spirituality. Wow, now that's soul injury that she had researched many years ago. Dr. Brown said something that day that I had never thought about. She talked about, in some of the narratives that some of the veterans that she interviewed with talked about the peace that they had. And one of the things that she said, I just want to read to you. This was a man who was describing to her the peace that he had when he was in combat. He said, I was probably most at peace when I knew I was going into harm's way. He said, hold on. Because I kind of got my mind right. And I said my prayers. I got right with my Maker, and I made sure things were lined up because I've got a child. And then I was able to come to this place where he said, and whatever was going to happen was going to happen. And when she said that, I thought, wow, here she had been interviewing young, much younger people, people who were not dying. And they were having that same window when they went in and anticipating their death, just as I had had with thousands of veterans who were anticipating their death. And that really opened my eyes, because I had made assumptions previously that when people were going into battle that they were not at peace with that. So at any rate, that whole last sentence, and whatever was going to happen was going to happen. Now that is living in the now. That is living in the soul. So at Opus Peace, we have developed our program and our values around about a three-pronged approach, and it's kind of summarized in our Opus Peace prayer, which is this: cultivate in me the willingness to reown, rehome, and revitalize scattered pieces of myself so wholeness can be restored. Grow in me the honesty, courage, and humility to release my fear of who I am and who I am not. Fuel me with your grace. So you may be saying, well, where do we go from here? I understand the concept now. Where do we go from here? So certainly what we want to do, and
Hi, everyone. It sounds like we lost Deborah, so let's just give it 1 second. Let her get back online. Yeah, thank you all for filling in the chat box and raising your hands. We know that there's some issues with the sound, so hopefully we'll be right back up and running in just a minute.
she said 29.
Hi, everyone. Again, we're working to get sound back on. It'll just be 1 more minute. Deborah is dialing back in.
Right. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. All right. So, Catherine, at what point did you lose me?
Let's see, right after the first bullet about identify and respond.
Okay. So the other thing is that we have developed this inventory that is intended to be a self-help tool to get to the heart of matters quickly so that we can have conversations about this soul injury and how to approach it. So I'm just going to show you briefly, and you're going to be able to get the inventory on both our website and NHPCO's website. So don't go there right now. For right now, I want you to simply see what we have available. And you're going to see all these elements that I talked about earlier, all these clues for what creates a soul injury. You're going to see them in this little 8-question inventory. The first being, I'm not able to be my real self. And certainly if that's always true, that's very high risk, obviously, for soul injury. The second one, I engage in some activities to help me avoid uncomfortable feelings. Number 3, when I avoid uncomfortable feelings, it often causes problems with people in my life. And 4, I have a hard time facing loss, change, disappointments, or transitions. 5, guilt or shame haunt me. I feel defective, inadequate, or unworthy. Self-compassion is difficult. Or I struggle to find meaning in my life. So this gives you an idea of the questions that can start very relevant conversations. I want to give you an example of somebody that said that how they used the inventory. And this is how they did it. I had presented on this, and the person had taken the inventory for themselves. She came up to me after the presentation and she said, "Could I have a blank one?" And I gave her one. I didn't ask her anything about it. She didn't tell me anymore. But about a week later, I got an email from this woman. And this woman said this. She said she took it home, gave it to her adult daughter, and this is what she said to her daughter. She said, "I'd like you to take this inventory, and afterward, let's talk about how my alcoholism caused a soul injury in you when you were a child." Wow. Whoa. So you can see how this opens the door in a safe, non-threatening way to have important conversations start to take place. So we have developed even soul injury toolkits that we are working on right now. And I want to just kind of give you an idea of where this came from, because you might be surprised that it actually started when I became burned out from doing hospice work many years ago. When we started our hospice program, the workload wasn't too bad. We were just getting started. We didn't have a whole lot of referrals and what have you. But as business started picking up, and I was the nurse practitioner managing the patients on this 10-bed unit, in addition to doing all the consults around the hospital, and my business was picking up. It was getting more and more, and I was responding by trying to work harder and faster and longer. And pretty soon, I didn't have much of a sense of self left. So I was starting to get what we would call burned out. I don't really agree with that term. I think when we lose a sense of connection with the part of ourself holding the pain that we're experiencing when we're with grieving patients and families, that can cause a soul injury. So at any rate, I go to see my supervisor, and I say to my supervisor, I said, I'm getting burned out. And I saw this advertisement, for jobs over in the alcohol treatment unit. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I've never worked in anything but hospice. So, that might be kind of interesting, and I, won't have to put in such long hours and work so hard, and maybe I'll get a sense of myself back. Well, my supervisor very kindly listened to me as I'm talking to her about maybe considering applying for this job and transferring off the hospice unit to another program. And then she said to me, she said, "No, you don't want to do that." And she said, "Your passion is hospice." She said, "You just need to focus on recovering your passion, and then you can stay right where you're at, which is where you really want to be." So I looked at her that day and I said, well, I've lost my passion. I don't even know where it is, and I'm not even sure I have a me left. So she said, "Well, you go do what you need to do." So at any rate, I kind of went back to the drawing board then, and I said, gee, could I do all these consults differently? What could I do that would make things go faster and easier, and I wouldn't have to put in all this time? How could I get to the heart of the matter quickly? And that's when I decided that maybe what I could do is to craft questions very carefully that would provoke answers from beyond that facade, that I wouldn't have to waste a lot of time with kind of chit-chat, getting to know and building trust, but that maybe I could craft questions very carefully to get to the heart of the matter quickly. And that maybe I could create some self-help tools that I could leave behind, and that I could then come to see the patient the next day. And in fact, we could have a very relevant conversation. So these tools that have kind of been developed, I wouldn't say over 30 years, but probably the last 15 years of my practice by not only myself, by our team, was what is being put into a program now that will be able to respond and give clinicians tools to be able to respond in a way that saves time and really gets to the heart of the matter so we can have important conversations. I just want to tell you, I want to close with something. I was on the phone just last week with a very wise hospice medical director. I was on the phone to talk about coming there to do a presentation on soul injury. This was at Seasons Hospice in Chicago. And Dr. Nadananjan said to me this. He said, I heard you speak at the NHPCO conference last spring. And he said, I was sitting there and he said, you know, we have a red, yellow, green triage system for symptom management. And when we have patients with symptoms out of control and they're in that red zone, he said, it's all hands on deck. And we get those symptoms under control. And he said, I'm really proud of how we do that. And he said, but when I was at that conference sitting there listening to you, he said, I realized that after we get our patients into the green zone, that's not enough, that there's something more. And he said, I realized that day that something more is soul injury. Well, I got to tell you, if we hadn't been on the phone, I would have jumped up and kissed him, because I thought, oh yes, this is exactly what I have been seeing for years and years. So this, it reminds me that the goal of hospice care is not symptom management. Symptom management is the essential vehicle to achieve the goal of healing. And responding to soul injury is the essential goal, is the essential vehicle, rather, to achieve the goal of healing. Dying people are fertile ground for healing. If you were given a terminal diagnosis today, I guarantee you, your life would change dramatically, and there would be a lot of emotional and spiritual, soulful healing that occurs over the next days. So I always say you only get to die once, and we don't want to miss the opportunity to be present. So soul injury resources, certainly our website, and we have a new website that was just launched. So if you haven't checked that out, we just launched it last week. So, and we'll still be adding more to it, but I would encourage you to check that out at opuspeace.org or soulinjury.org, either one, go to the same place. We do have an Opus Peace Institute for soul injury training, in which we train other people like yourselves in how to be messengers for soul injury and to take these tools out into your community to be able to raise the awareness about the phenomena of soul injury. Our next training is in October, and the one after that is in February. Those are the ones we have scheduled. So we also will be having soon memberships in which we provide self-help toolkits for people. Those will be coming soon and available to people. Catherine already mentioned the two books, Peace at Last and The Hero Within. Those are available on my website, on our website, I'm sorry. DVDs, the Soul Injury DVD, the actual DVD that presents the whole overarching concept of soul injury, and the new DVD, Liberating Unmourned Loss, which is available on Hospice Foundation of America's website. And soul injury and the unmourned loss films are available on HFA with 2 CEs. If you're interested in putting on a community engagement event, you can use those DVDs as a platform for whatever your cause is. It may not even necessarily be hospice. So I just want to leave you with the idea that Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, said. She said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So we would just encourage you to consider participating in the soul injury movement, much as HFA is, much as NHPCO is. And we want and need your help. So with that, I will entertain questions. Catherine, if you have any for us.
Yeah, thank you again so much, Deborah. And I know the questions are just starting to roll in. So I wanted to to give you the first one, which was actually one that came via email before the webinar even started. She said, I want to make sure that I get this in. So her question to you was, do you have advice to process versus hold in the pain from overwhelmingly sad news stories? So, for example, things coming up regarding, the recent abuses in church, high veteran suicide rates, things of that nature that may be coming up with patients now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a rather complicated question that requires quite a bit of time for me to kind of sort that out and answer that. So at any rate, I'm probably going to decline doing that because I honestly don't think I can do that question justice. There are several things that can be done, and maybe we can do a whole forum on that. But it's that's a little bit. I've been in those situations a lot. I do speak on that exact topic, but as I said, that's a complicated question that requires. I don't want to give a simple answer. It would not do it justice.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for addressing that. Again, a lot of comments coming in about people, just regarding the usefulness of this presentation and having something practical and having something to take away. One of the other questions that came in from Jody was, do you have to be a nurse or someone in a clinical position to attend the training?
No, the answer is no. We've done several trainings, and typically about 50% will be clinicians and 50% will not be. So no, part of the soul injury program that we have, it provides self-help tools. So we're an educational organization that provides self-help tools. You do not have to be a clinician. Certainly lots of clinicians and agencies are using our materials, but you do not have to be.
Got it. All right. So we did have a few people with questions regarding chaplains. So one question is, let's see. So at what point would you refer this to a chaplain?
Well, I think, early on is great, obviously. Yeah. I mean, soul injuries are multifaceted, and chaplains are absolutely essential, I think, that can augment the response, and they can often really lead the clinical team in this type of expertise. Yeah, absolutely. So they should be referred early on.
Wonderful. Got it. Okay, I know that this is something that usually comes up in a lot of your presentations, is the soul injury versus moral injury. So one question that came up, as a chaplain, I'm hearing much of this language is equivalent to that of moral injury. The language of soul injury is synonymous with the language of the chaplain and is a concept that is spoken of almost every day in the chaplain world, both in the VA and U.S. military services. So what we as clinical chaplains have seen is often other clinicians are uncomfortable with addressing issues of the soul and of the spirit. I applaud other clinicians addressing this issue. Question, has this been shared with chaplains in the VA?
So the answer is yes, and I totally agree with what he's saying. So again, first of all, to make the distinction between moral injury and soul injury, and especially in hospice, it is the moral injuries are the ones that tend to surface at the end of life, when it has to do with their military service. But these veterans who are dying, there's much more to them than just their military service, and they've often experienced other things. So the Department of Defense and the VA's definition of moral injury is a violation of deeply held beliefs. So if you think about a child, for example, who has been molested, they don't have any deeply held moral beliefs yet to be violated. And yet they have experienced an injury against their being, so to speak. And if they don't get, if that's not addressed, it can haunt them for the rest of their lives. So, as I said, the soul injury kind, we struggled a long time with whether or not to try to use the term moral injury, and we just found that much of the time it absolutely was on point, but sometimes it didn't. There was resistance sometimes from veterans because they'd say, well, it implied that they had done something wrong, and they would say, gee, when you're being shot at, when you're just trying to survive, I don't know that I did anything wrong. I was doing what I was trained to do. So there was sometimes some pushback as far as that idea of a moral injury, which it might imply to them that they had done something wrong, when in fact that was not the case. And then, of course, the other thing, which was they had suffered a lot of other things that did not violate their moral code, but in fact had violated them as in their personhood. So we absolutely support moral injury and all of Jonathan Shea's work and others that has been done. And we think that the research of that happening with moral injury is also pointing to bigger dimensions, and that's why we call it a soul injury. And he's right. Our chaplains are some of our greatest supporters and saying, "Oh, thank you for doing this."
Okay, we have a lot of other just comments coming in. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation and for providing this information to us. This is awesome. Looking forward to participating in October at the Soul Injury Leadership Training. Someone else asked if you will have another book coming out anytime soon.
Well, I definitely am hoping to. So, yeah, my hope is that it will be by the end of next year. So, and it will be on soul injury.
Wonderful. Let's see. So a few other, I think, questions coming in just regarding sort of technicalities. So again, I want to just let everyone know that a recording of the webinar will be available on the We Honor Veterans website. So again, under educational resources, this is where we always place all of our recordings and any tools that are posted from the webinar recordings. However, a little bit extra, we will now have a landing page for all of Deborah Grassman and Opus Peace materials that we have done in collaboration with We Honor Veterans. So the recording of her last webinar that many of you all were present for on caring for Vietnam veterans. This recording will be there as well as other soul injury resources and this toolkit that Deborah went over. So there will be a link on our homepage under the Spotlight section to that landing page where you can find everything associated with this webinar, and then it will be under our educational resources as well. And again, unfortunately, we do not offer continuing education credits, but if you, your staff, or volunteers participated in this or view it again at a later time, it most definitely counts towards your educational requirement activities for your partner reports for We Honor Veterans. So just want to mention that again. Let's see, more comments on what a wonderful presentation this was and how helpful it was. Someone else asked if you could repeat the prayer that you mentioned, or if maybe the text is somewhere on your website, or if they should just go back and listen to that at a later time.
The prayer is definitely on our website.
Okay.
But it's on the screen right now also.
Oh.
Yeah, I just put it up, but it is on our website.
Okay. So let's see. So another question from Donna: would this training not be extremely helpful for those who are in harm's way at home? For example, law enforcement and other first responders, as they are dying from suicide at a very high rate, and much of it, if not all of it, is from soul injuries.
Wow. Well, she is very insightful. Well, it's funny that you asked, because Pat McGuire is sitting right beside me. And just this morning, she was over in Tampa with the Tampa first responders teaching in their PTSD. They have a 5-day training or retreat that they do for first responders over in Tampa. And she is over there. She taught in that just this morning. So she teaches about grieving and releasing those losses and soul injuries. So yeah, Donna, that was very astute, and it is happening and being again extrapolated into the non-veteran population. First responders are at great risk. Families of veterans, we do some programs for them as well.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so another question from Andrea. Is there a recommended strategy or plan for working with the soul injured veterans, bereaved family and or friends?
Read that again. A specific bereavement plan per se?
Yeah, for injured veterans, for their loved ones or family or friends, maybe just sort of an initial approach for helping them through this.
Well, I can't say that we have a formalized soul injury bereavement plan, although that sounds very intriguing to me, and I think we could very easily do it because, we definitely have all the elements there. But I think, it really just starts again with that conversation and having that conversation, just as you would do with anybody else that I outlined up there. We actually have in our plans, it will hopefully be implemented by the end of next year, is we will have these programs contextualized for very specific populations like she is talking about, whether it be bereaved, divorced people who've been divorced, people who've been molested, we will have these soul injury programs contextualized for very specific populations. That's on our horizon, and we hope to achieve that within a year.
Okay, so a few other questions. People are quite the eager beavers wanting to know how much longer until the toolkits will be available. So I know that Deborah Grassman and the Opus Peace team will be sending that over to us, and we will have everything up on the We Honor Veterans website within the next week.
So you know that the membership toolkits are being piloted right now. In fact, I just got home last night from a hospice in Tennessee who is in the pilot. So we are piloting them right now, and I guess if Angela Seif is our executive director is on the line, she can maybe give you better than I the trajectory timeline. Angela is. Nope, she may have dropped off. I know she was on earlier. So, at any rate, to answer that question, and I hope I'm not too far off, but I think by the end of the year, of this year. So we're within a few months.
Okay, let's see. Again, just more thanks. Yeah, again, thank you for putting the prayer up again, as I will be using that often, so it is much appreciated. Thank you, Irene. Yeah, was there anything else that maybe, initially in the overview we skipped, or anything else you'd like to add, Deborah?
No, I just, again, want to say our whole team is just so appreciative of your support of this work, because it truly, I believe, is going to give clinicians the tools they're going to need to be able to address some of these issues that often surface. So the fact that you recognize that we can really get some tools in place that can help have important conversations. As I said, we're just extremely humbled by your recognition and value of this work that these 10,000 dying veterans bring to us.
Well, I have to say, I think I echo all of the other participants' views when I just say, you know, thank you, thank you. You know, we continue to just be humbled by everything that you share, and just remain in gratitude for all that you're willing to give to partners. You know, we on our veterans are really thankful for our relationship with Opus Peace, and for those out there that collaborate with us on an ongoing basis, just so we can provide you, our partners, and people in the field who are the ones actually serving veterans. So we really can't say thank you enough.
Well, we are here to serve, definitely. That's our purpose. And everybody on the line can feel free to contact us on our website. There is a place. If you have more questions about the memberships, you can email our executive director, Angela Stipe, at executive-director at opuspeace.org, and she'll be glad to respond to some of those questions that you might have. So I just thank all of you for your passion for veterans, for wanting to care for veterans, especially at the end of life, and for all people. And the work, it takes a lot of courage to do the work that all of us do. And I just appreciate that every single one of you have taken the time and the energy to listen to this and to do the work that you do. So I thank you.
Well, thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you have any questions or feedback, send them on to veterans@nhpco.org or the Opus Peace team. We'll be happy to pass anything on to them as well, to them and Deborah. Okay, well, thank you so much, and enjoy your Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you.